Disco Demolition Night is considered one of the darkest, most embarrassing chapters in the history of both baseball and disco. In the Chicago White Sox Stadium, rock and roll fans gathered in their thousands to destroy disco records, organised by Steve Dahl. The event eventually turned into a riot, with 7,000 fans rushing the field, described as a party that just got out of hand by some, and a literal book burning by others. But Disco Demolition Night reveals a more insidious insight into America's attitudes towards black and queer artists in the 70s, and was a pivotal moment in disco history. Thursday the 12th of July, 1979, Chicago, USA. What had been a sweltering day in the windy city was finally beginning to cool off as the area settled into the evening. Down on the south side of Chicago, bordering the neighborhood of Bridgeport, sat Comiskey Park, the home of Chicago White Sox. That afternoon, the home team had continued a lackluster season with another loss in the first game of a doubleheader against the Detroit Tigers. Strangely though, the fans in attendance that evening didn't seem to mind. For the past 2 hours, the crowd of mostly drunk, high and shirtless men had been volleying across the stadium back and forth with chants of Once the first game finished, the chants reached a fever pitch as tensions grew ahead of the halftime entertainment. Booked that evening was local disc jockey Steve Dahl of the WLUP radio, The Loop. The previous year, Dahl had been laid off by rival Chicago station WDAI, and they switched to a strictly disco format. As Ronald, the 24-year-old rock and roll aficionado, refused to play on principle. With his new home at The Loop and an axe to grind, Dahl started what would become a recurring segment, an eventual tirade against disco. In between playing predominantly American classic rock, Dahl would play the intro to disco records before scratching the needle over the wax and playing explosion sound effects, simulating the act of blowing up the records. Additionally, Dahl would often preach his contempt for disco, citing the perceived exclusivity of the subculture, the lack of substance in the music, the affirmation of the dress code, and worst of all, his feelings of being forced to dance. What started as a gag soon became a movement. Dahl, with his anti-disco rhetoric, inadvertently tapped in the consciousness of predominantly white men who had either grown tired of disco or, more cynically, saw disco as an existential threat to traditional American values. Mike Veeck, the 28-year-old son of the White Sox owner, was an admirer of Dahl. He empathized with Dahl's anti-disco rants and found his explosive antics on WLUP hilarious. Veeck was placed in charge of organizing promotions at Comiskey Park to help improve attendance and, with the help of Dahl, came up with the idea to host a live Disco Demolition Night. The idea was simple. Fans would bring a disco record to the stadium and would be allowed admittance to the doubleheader for 98 cents. At halftime, Steve Dahl would blow up the records himself, but both Veeck and Dahl failed to anticipate the sheer number of Chicagoans that would show up. By 2:30, the venue was officially sold out and the ushers closed the gates. But this didn't deter the fans, and many more bribed, snuck, and climbed into the ground ahead of the halftime show. Whilst the official capacity of Comiskey Park was 44,000, many estimate that the crowd in attendance was far more. By halftime, most of the records collected at the gates had been gathered into a large metal skip in the centre field. Once the stage was set, Dahl took to the field to take command of his anti-disco army. Dressed in a military helmet, a jacket, and riding on a jeep, Dahl rode out to the field and seized a microphone.
Well, listen, we took all the disco records that you brought tonight. We got them in a giant box, and we're going to blow them up real good.
After detonation, records were sent flying into the sky. Dahl and his entourage took one last victory lap in their Jeep before making their exit. Immediately after their departure, all hell broke loose. The spectacle wasn't enough. Fans started storming the pitch in what would become a riot, and by the end of the evening, over 7,000 people had invaded the field. They got into fights, ripped up the bases, tore down the battling cages and lit fires. Records that hadn't been collected at the gates were hurled like frisbees by the spectators in the stands, adding to the carnage. After almost an hour of mayhem, the police were brought in to disperse the crowd. 39 people were arrested, the White Sox were forced to forfeit the second game, and America was left grappling, trying to understand what they'd just witnessed. Was Disco Demolition Night just a mob of young, drunken idiots cutting loose and having fun? Or an early battleground of the bubbling culture war, fueled in hatred, homophobia, and racism? It's important that we state Steve Dahl's side. He denies any allegation of racism or homophobia, and we quote from his 2016 book, Disco Demolition, The Night Disco Died, that he is worn out from defending himself as a racist and a homophobe. The event was not anti-racist, not anti-gay. We were just kids pissing on a musical genre. He claims to have been defending the Chicago rock and roll lifestyle from the disco musical invasion. Now let's rewind 20 years. Disco as a movement began sometime in the late 1960s in the dilapidated ruins of New York's warehouses, loft spaces, and abandoned hotels. Deindustrialization, coupled with a growing population of blue-collar workers fleeing the Jim Crow South, had a mass exodus of white-collar workers to the suburbs, led to a mass unemployment. The decreased tax revenue and increased borrowing placed the municipality in crippling debt, leading to harsh austerity. Public services were the first to find their funding cut, rubbish began to pile up in the streets, and corruption spread through the police like a virus. In the midst of the recession, the municipal government put in place a series of rent control regulations to help protect low-income residents. Many of the city's landlords protested these measures and began allowing their properties to fall into disrepair and even committing arson, making their properties unlivable. It is within this backdrop of a crumbling city on the brink of collapse that disco emerged as a form of escapism and relief. During the founding years of disco, on the dance floors of DJs Terry Noel, Francis Grasso, and David Mancuso, you'd be more likely to hear the anglicised blues by the Rolling Stones, the percussive Afro-psychedelia of Babatunde Otunji, or the spiritual choral singing of Les Troubadours than you would of any searing solos by disco divas. The early tastemakers were remnants of the 1960s countercultural movement, with a love for psychedelic rock, extended percussive breaks, and ethereal atmospheric transcendence. The DJs wanted to take their audience on a trip, often supplemented by the drug of choice at the time, LSD. And depending how you looked at it, disco can either be seen as a celebration of the successes of liberal America, or the last gasps of a swinging 60s. Either way, disco held community, integration, inclusivity at its core, and the central tenets of the growing gay rights movement. Disco soundtracked the movement, but more importantly, helped foster communities of out and proud clubgoers who no longer felt chastised as social pariahs, but instead defiant in their sexuality. Disco facilitated a newfound politics of pleasure. But like all good things, it didn't last long before corporate America quickly wrapped its arms around disco. Many traditionally white record labels such as Columbia began to take note of disco's rising stars, and despite years of indifference to black musical forms such as soul and R&B, began investing heavily in the genre, producing their first number one hit in 1976 with Johnny Taylor's Disco Lady. However, even with the influx of white investment, black musicians saw very little reward. In 1973, just before the disco boom took off, black artists accounted for 36% of the 100 best-selling singles in the US. And by 1978, the percentage was down to 21%. It wasn't just in the charts that capitalism was spreading its tentacles, but with the success of John Travolta and John Brandon's Saturday Night Fever, disco dancing and the discotheque had officially become commodifiable assets. By 1979, there were an estimated 20,000 discotheques in the US alone, all trying to capitalize on the success of clubs like Studio 54. Commercialization and capitalism changed the face of disco, creating a product more palatable to middle America. Disco was still very much camp, but removed were the more outwardly gay aspects of the subculture. In a similar vein, people of colour became increasingly marginalised from the dance floor. By the late 70s, in many clubs across America, the only people of colour would be either the DJs or the staff. And in spite of white and straight washing of disco, Steve Dahl and his army of rock and roll fanatics still condemned what they saw as corrupting force sweeping America. Steve Dahl did only ask for disco records. And before anyone points out, yes, you're right, it's not racist to dislike a genre. But something more insidious was happening at Disco Demolition Night, and a key detail was left out at the start of the video. Working as a White Sox usher that day was the 14-year-old Vince Lawrence. Not an ideal job for a black teenager in the late 70s, given Comiskey Park's close proximity to the notoriously prejudiced neighbourhood of Bridgeport. But Vince remained headstrong, determined to save enough money to buy his first synthesizer. He first noticed something was off that day when he started reading the titles of the records being brought in by the attendees. And remember when I told you the attendees could get in cheaper to the game if they brought in a record? Well, the Demolition required disco records, but Vince noticed the majority of records weren't disco. They were just records by black artists. Not just disco artists, black artists. There is a distinct irony to the violence and destruction that unfolded at Comiskey Park. Many of the perceived tenets of disco that the crowd rallied against, such as polyester suits and performative dancing, can be attributed to the commercialization of disco, rather than the original underground movement. Many of the critiques of commercial disco that Dahl and his Kabbalah followers held were likely shared with many of disco's club-going originators. Now, they should in no way apologise for the actions of that evening, but serving as an undercurrent upon which Dahl founded his platform was a fear and hatred of homosexual, black and Latino culture. Once dubbed America's favourite pastime, baseball has offered a reflection of the American psyche for well over a century. So Disco Demolition Night then can be seen as an early battleground of a culture war that still rages today. But disco never really died. Instead, it retreated underground, kept alive by Larry Levan at Paradise Garage, Arthur Russell, and progressed by Loft Baby Frankie Knuckles in Chicago's The Warehouse. The music played by Knuckles in The Warehouse would eventually be referred to as house music, and would help inspire Comiskey Park's very own Vince Lawrence to co-produce and record the first house record, On and On. Paradoxically, Disco Demolition Night and the hateful rhetoric of Steve Dahl may have been the best thing that ever happened to disco and underground music. Disco was finally free from the scorn of conservative America and opportunists looking to make a quick buck. And out of the spotlight, people could return to what they've always done, dancing the night away in a sea of perfect strangers. We hope you enjoyed this video. We spent a lot of time getting this right, and you can also read the full, more detailed article we published on this story at www.dancepolicy.com. Please subscribe to our channel for more unapologetic storytelling in dance and youth culture. This is the first of many videos we hope to publish and give more niche insights into stories that aren't commonly known. Thank you.